In Rick and Morty, hope is never framed as salvation. It is framed as exposure. Where many stories treat hope as moral strength or emotional resilience, Rick and Morty treats it as a gamble, one that frequently ends in damage. This is not cynicism for its own sake. It is a deliberate philosophical stance built into the show's characters, structure, and consequences. Hope in this world creates vulnerability. To hope is to assume that the future can justify the present, that effort might be rewarded, that attachment might be worth the cost. The show consistently undermines those assumptions, not by declaring them false in abstract terms, but by allowing them to fail in practice. When characters hope, the universe does not meet them halfway. It continues, indifferent and unresponsive. Rick understands this early, and his worldview is shaped around minimizing exposure. His rejection of hope is not framed as wisdom, but as risk management. Hope invites expectation. Expectation invites disappointment. Disappointment invites pain that cannot be intellectualized away. Rick chooses despair, not because it feels good, but because it feels controlled. Despair stabilizes the future by assuming the worst. Hope destabilizes it by introducing possibility. The show repeatedly demonstrates that hope does not scale well in an infinite universe. In a multiverse where outcomes proliferate endlessly, hoping for a specific result becomes statistically meaningless. Any desired outcome exists somewhere, but so does its failure. Hope does not increase the likelihood of success. It only increases emotional investment. That investment is where harm occurs. This is why Rick mocks hopeful frameworks so aggressively. Therapy, moral progress, redemption arcs, and grand narratives all rely on hope as a prerequisite. They ask the individual to trust that effort will lead to improvement. Rick treats that trust as irresponsible. From his perspective, hope is a liability disguised as virtue. It encourages people to open themselves to outcomes they cannot control. Morty embodies the tension this creates. Morty continues to hope despite repeated evidence that the universe will not reward him for it. His hope is not naive in the traditional sense. It is stubborn. He hopes because not hoping feels worse. The show does not present Morty's hope as correct, but it does present it as human. This contrast is crucial. Rick and Morty does not argue that hope is false. It argues that hope is costly. The cost of hope is rarely immediate. It accumulates. Characters who hope experience sharper disillusionment when things fail. Their pain is not greater because they were wrong, but because they were invested. The show treats that investment as dangerous precisely because it cannot be undone. Once you care, you cannot retroactively uncare. Hope leaves residue. This is why the show is so resistant to redemption narratives. Redemption depends on the belief that effort will eventually be met with meaningful change. Rick and Morty undermines this belief by allowing effort to fail quietly. Characters try improve briefly and then relapse or stall. The absence of narrative payoff reframes hope as something that must justify itself without guarantees. Hope also threatens Rick's sense of inevitability. If hope is valid, then the future is open. If the future is open, then the past becomes questionable. Rick depends on the idea that things could not have gone differently. Hope reintroduces the idea that alternatives were possible. That implication destabilizes his entire identity. This is why Rick treats hope not just as foolish, but as hostile. The show's structure reinforces this philosophy. Episodes rarely end with uplift. Even when something positive occurs, it is undercut, limited, or contextualized as temporary. This is not cruelty. It is consistency. Hope is not punished because it is wrong. It is punished because it is risky. The universe does not conspire to destroy hope. It simply refuses to protect it. Importantly, the show does not advocate for hopelessness as an ideal state. Hopelessness is not framed as healthy or admirable. It is framed as survivable. Rick survives by minimizing emotional variance. Hope introduces variance. It creates highs that make lows unbearable. By flattening expectation, Rick reduces volatility. The cost is numbness, but numbness is predictable. The show also distinguishes between hope and care. Care persists even when hope is absent. Characters continue to protect, sacrifice, and attach themselves to others without believing things will improve. This distinction matters. Rick and Morty suggests that care does not require optimism, it requires presence. Hope, by contrast, projects value into the future rather than anchoring it in the present. This is why the show's most sincere moments are quiet and uncelebrated. They are not hopeful. They are immediate. Someone stays when leaving would be easier. Someone helps without expecting resolution. These acts are not framed as steps toward a better world. They are framed as temporary resistances against indifference. Hope would turn them into investments. The show refuses that framing. Hope also introduces moral pressure. If hope exists, then giving up becomes a failure. Rick and Morty rejects this pressure. It allows characters to stop trying without moral condemnation. This is deeply uncomfortable, but intentional. The show refuses to weaponize hope as an obligation. It treats hope as optional, not virtuous by default. In this framework, despair is not the opposite of hope. It is an alternative strategy. It limits exposure by assuming loss. The tragedy is that this strategy works just well enough to trap Rick inside it. He avoids the sharpest pain of disappointment, but he also avoids the possibility of genuine change. Hope is risky because it might reveal that despair was never necessary. The show's treatment of hope is therefore not nihilistic. It is cautious. It recognizes that in a universe without guarantees, hope is not free. It costs attention, emotion, and vulnerability. Some characters pay that cost willingly. Others refuse. The show does not judge either choice. It shows the consequences of both. Rick and Morty treats hope as a risk because hope invites belief without protection. It asks the individual to open themselves to a future that may never arrive. In a universe that does not care, that openness is dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it hurts. The show does not tell you not to hope. It shows you what hope costs and refuses to pretend the price is fair. The risk of hope becomes even clearer when viewed through how the show handles effort. In many narratives, effort is morally protected. Trying hard is framed as inherently worthwhile, even when it fails. Rick and Morty removes that protection. Effort does not grant immunity from harm, embarrassment, or futility. Trying does not make failure noble, and persistence does not guarantee growth. This does not mean effort is mocked, but it is stripped of its moral insulation. Hope is risky because it often attaches itself to effort, promising that trying will be redeemed by outcome. The show repeatedly breaks that promise. This is why effort in the series often feels exhausting rather than inspiring. Characters exert themselves only to arrive somewhere emotionally similar to where they started, or worse. The absence of payoff reframes effort as exposure. When you try, you reveal what you want. Revealed desire can be disappointed, exploited, or ignored. Rick avoids hope because it would force him to admit what he wants, and wanting is where the universe can hurt you most efficiently. Hope also creates narrative momentum toward the future. And the show is deeply suspicious of futures that claim authority over the present. Futures justify sacrifice. They make present suffering tolerable by promising later meaning. Rick and Morty repeatedly dismantles this logic. Futures arrive compromised, incomplete, or irrelevant. The present is never retroactively justified. Hope becomes dangerous because it encourages people to endure damage now in exchange for a future that may never honor the bargain. This is especially evident in how the show treats long-term plans. Plans fail not because they are poorly designed, but because the universe refuses to align itself with intention. The randomness of outcome is not chaos, but indifference. Hope assumes alignment. Rick understands that alignment is not guaranteed, so he treats hope as a faulty risk assessment. The show also separates hope from resilience. Resilience in this world is not optimism. It is adaptation without illusion. Characters survive not because they believe things will get better, but because they continue despite not believing that. This distinction matters. Hope implies expectation. Resilience implies endurance. Rick rejects hope while embodying a brutal form of resilience. He survives by assuming nothing will improve and acting accordingly. That survival strategy is costly, but it is stable. Hope destabilizes because it introduces variance. Emotional variance creates highs and lows. Rick minimizes variance by flattening expectation. The cost is emotional range. The benefit is predictability. In an indifferent universe, predictability feels safer than possibility. The show's resistance to hope also prevents moral coercion. In many stories, hope becomes an obligation. If change is possible, then refusing to hope is framed as weakness or failure. Rick and Morty refuses that framing. It does not shame characters for giving up. It allows exhaustion to exist without moral correction. This is uncomfortable, but intentional. Hope is not treated as a duty. This refusal also protects the show from sentimentality. Sentimentality relies on the belief that emotional openness will be rewarded. Rick and Morty does not reward openness consistently enough to sustain that belief. When openness appears, it is fragile, fleeting, and often punished by circumstance rather than malice. The show does not suggest the universe is cruel. It suggests it is uninterested. Hope becomes risky because it assumes interest where none is guaranteed. The universe does not respond to sincerity, effort, or belief. It responds to mechanics. Rick aligns himself with the mechanics because mechanics do not disappoint. They either work or they do not. Hope introduces an emotional stake into a system that does not acknowledge emotional investment. Yet the show never fully eradicates hope. It allows it to appear in small local forms. Not hope for a better universe, but hope for a moment of connection, a brief relief, a temporary alignment. These hopes are not scalable. They are not transferable. They exist only in the present and dissolve quickly. This containment is deliberate. Large hopes create large wounds. Small hopes create small ones. Rick's tragedy is that he cannot tolerate even small hope without fearing escalation. He knows how easily hope grows, how quickly it demands more. To him, hope is not a feeling. It is a slippery slope. Once you believe something might improve, you begin measuring your life against that belief. Measurement leads to dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction leads to regret. Rick cuts the process off at the beginning. The show does not endorse this choice, but it explains it. It shows how hope can become a weapon against those who carry it. Not because hope is false, but because it assumes fairness in a universe that does not promise it. Rick and Morty treats hope as a risk because it exposes the believer to harm without offering protection in return. In the end, hope in this series is not condemned or celebrated. It is contextualized. It is shown as something that costs something. Sometimes the cost is worth paying. Sometimes it is not. The show refuses to decide that for the viewer. Hope is risky because it asks you to live as if the future owes you something. Rick and Morty insists that the future owes nothing. Anything you get is contingent, temporary, and unguaranteed. Caring in that environment is possible. Hoping in it is dangerous. The show's honesty lies in refusing to soften that danger. It does not tell you to abandon hope. It tells you what hope actually demands in a universe that does not care whether you have it. The show's treatment of hope becomes even more severe when viewed through how it handles meaning over time. Hope assumes continuity. It assumes that effort now will be legible later, that the future will remember what the present endured. Rick and Morty repeatedly denies that continuity. Time passes, contexts change, and what once felt significant becomes irrelevant without ceremony. Hope becomes risky because it ties emotional investment to a future that may not preserve its meaning. This is why the show rarely allows hope to compound. When something hopeful occurs, it is isolated. It does not stack cleanly on top of previous progress. Gains are fragile, often erased by shifts in circumstance rather than deliberate reversal. The narrative refuses to let hope become cumulative capital. This prevents the audience from believing that endurance will eventually be rewarded with stability. Hope remains episodic, not developmental. Rick understands this instability intuitively. He does not just reject hope because it can fail, but because it can succeed briefly and then vanish. That vanishing is worse than failure. Failure confirms expectations. Temporary success creates contrast. Contrast sharpens loss. Rick avoids hope because it increases the amplitude of suffering rather than reducing it. Despair flattens experience. Hope creates peaks that make valleys intolerable. The show also treats hope as a form of narrative bias. Hope encourages people to interpret ambiguous signals as progress. Small changes become signs. Neutral outcomes become steps forward. Rick and Morty resists this interpretive drift. Ambiguity remains ambiguous. Improvement is not automatically framed as direction. By refusing to validate hopeful interpretation, the show exposes how easily hope manufactures meaning where none is guaranteed. This is especially visible in how the show handles reconciliation. Reconciliation appears, but it is rarely stable. Conflicts pause rather than resolve. Emotional distance narrows and then widens again. Hope would frame these moments as milestones. The show frames them as fluctuations. Rick treats reconciliation with suspicion because he understands how easily fluctuation masquerades as progress. The narrative also separates hope from courage. Courage in this world is not believing things will improve. It is acting without that belief. Characters who act bravely often do so without optimism. They protect, stay, or sacrifice knowing it may change nothing. This reframing, strips hope of its moral monopoly. You do not need to hope to act. You need to decide. That decision-making without optimism is uncomfortable because it removes emotional cushioning. Hope softens action by promising payoff. Acting without hope means acting without anesthesia. Rick prefers numbness to exposure. When others act without hope, it destabilizes his framework because it shows that despair is not the only alternative to optimism. There is a third mode, commitment without belief in outcome. The show allows this mode to exist, but it does not glorify it. It is exhausting, unsustainable, and often invisible. Acts done without hope are rarely rewarded or remembered. They do not build narratives. They simply happen. This reinforces the show's central claim. Meaning is not self-propagating. It must be reasserted continuously without guarantee. Hope also threatens Rick's sense of scale. Hope encourages long horizons. It asks people to think in terms of eventual outcomes. Rick operates on short horizons because short horizons limit exposure. The longer the horizon, the more uncertainty accumulates. The show repeatedly demonstrates that long-term thinking invites disappointment, not because it is wrong, but because it assumes coherence across time that the universe does not supply. This idea is why Rick prefers improvisation to planning, when plans imply investment. Improvisation accepts loss as a baseline. Planning implies belief in follow-through. Hope hides inside plans. Rick strips it out by treating the future as disposable. The cost is directionlessness. The benefit is insulation from betrayal by time. The show never suggests that this strategy is admirable. It shows that it works under specific conditions and fails under others. Rick survives, but he does not arrive. He endures, but he does not accumulate meaning. Hope could enable accumulation, but only by exposing him to loss he refuses to risk. As the argument deepens, it becomes clear that Rick and Morty does not oppose hope, because hope is false. It opposes hope because hope assumes a relationship with the future that the show refuses to endorse. The future is not an ally. It is not an adversary either. It is simply there, hoping that it will justify the present, is a gamble the show consistently portrays as unfair. The audience is left in an uncomfortable position. The show does not tell you to abandon hope, but it also refuses to reassure you that hope is safe. It forces a reevaluation of why hope is valued in the first place. Is hope virtuous because it leads to better outcomes, or because it makes the present more bearable? Rick and Morty suggests that hope often does neither. What remains is a quieter alternative: attention without expectation, caring without projection, acting without belief in redemption. These modes are not comforting. They do not scale. They do not solve meaninglessness, but they are survivable without self-deception. Hope is risky in this world because it asks you to believe that the universe will meet you halfway. Rick and Morty insists that the universe will not. Anything you build must be built knowing that it may collapse without explanation. The show does not condemn those who take that risk. It simply refuses to romanticize it. By treating hope as a risk rather than a virtue, the show dismantles one of storytelling's most reliable moral shortcuts. It replaces promise with honesty, not the honesty of despair, but the honesty of cost. Hope is not wrong, it is dangerous. And Rick and Morty refuses to pretend otherwise. The danger of hope becomes most apparent in how the show frames expectation as a form of self-betrayal. Expectation narrows perception. It teaches the mind to filter experience through anticipation, measuring the present against an imagined future. Rick and Morty treats this narrowing as a vulnerability. When you expect improvement, you stop seeing reality as it is and start seeing it as a prelude. That prelude can stretch indefinitely, hollowing out the present. Rick's hostility toward hope is therefore also hostility toward deferred living. He does not believe in sacrificing the present for a future that may never materialize. From his perspective, hope is a story people tell themselves to justify tolerating conditions they would otherwise reject. The show does demonstrate that hope can motivate action, but it also shows how easily that motivation turns into self-erasure. People endure more than they should because they believe endurance will be rewarded later. The narrative repeatedly strips that reward away, not as punishment, but as correction. It insists that endurance is not retroactively validated by survival. Survival only proves that survival occurred. Anything beyond that is interpretation. Hope encourages people to treat survival as proof of progress. Rick and Morty refuses that logic. Survival is neutral. What matters is what it costs. This refusal explains why the show is deeply suspicious of inspirational framing. Moments that might be uplifting in other stories are reframed as temporary alignments rather than turning points. The camera does not linger. Music does not swell. The episode does not pause to sanctify the moment. By denying these cues, the show prevents hope from hardening into belief. The moment it exists, then it passes. Hope also becomes risky because it creates asymmetry between inner and outer reality. Internally, hope generates momentum, meaning, and emotional narrative. Externally, the universe remains unchanged. That mismatch produces dissonance. The larger the hope, the larger the dissonance when the world fails to respond. Rick chooses to minimize that gap by aligning his inner expectations with outer indifference. It is not happiness, but it is coherence. The show repeatedly demonstrates that coherence matters more than comfort in the long term. Characters who cling to hope without recalibrating expectations often fracture more violently when reality intrudes. Characters who operate without hope fracture more quietly but remain functional. The show does not argue that this is preferable, only that it is sustainable under indifference. This is why hope is treated as a risk rather than a virtue. Virtues are assumed to be universally beneficial. Hope is not. It benefits under specific conditions: responsiveness, continuity, fairness. Rick and Morty depicts a universe where those conditions are unreliable. In such a universe, hope becomes situational at best and hazardous at worst. The show also refuses to let hope stand in for meaning. In many narratives, hope is meaning. The belief that things will improve is treated as justification for existence itself. Rick and Morty severs that connection. Meaning, when it appears, is immediate and local. It does not rely on the future to validate it. Hope, by contrast, exports meaning forward in time, where it becomes abstract and unprotected. This distinction is subtle but crucial. The show is not anti-meaning. It is anti-guarantee. It allows meaning to exist only where it can be directly experienced, not where it must be imagined. Hope asks you to imagine meaning before it arrives. Rick treats that imagination as a liability. As the essay continues, it becomes clear that Rick's rejection of hope is not rooted in superiority, but in risk calculation. He has learned through accumulation rather than ideology that hope magnifies pain more reliably than it produces change. That learning may be incomplete or biased, but it is not arbitrary. The show takes his position seriously enough to explore its consequences without endorsing it. Those consequences are severe. Without hope, time flattens. Days lose narrative shape. Effort becomes mechanical. Care persists, but without promise. The show does not pretend this is a healthy state. It presents it as a trade-off. Reduced exposure in exchange for reduced possibility. Rick accepts that trade because he believes possibility is more dangerous than emptiness. The audience is never told to accept the same trade. Instead, the show places the viewer in a position of discomfort, forced to confront how much modern storytelling relies on hope as a moral crutch. By removing that crutch, Rick and Morty exposes how fragile many of our assumptions about growth, effort, and virtue actually are. Hope is risky because it invites belief without leverage. It asks the universe to care. Rick and Morty insists that the universe does not negotiate. Anything you believe in must survive without reinforcement. Anything you hope for must be hoped for, knowing it may never arrive. The show's refusal to soften this truth is not cruelty. It is consistency. It does not say hope is foolish. It says hope is unprotected. Entering into it is a choice, not a moral obligation. And every choice carries cost. In the end, Rick and Morty treats hope as a risk because it treats honesty as more important than comfort. It will not tell you that things will be okay. It will only show you what it costs to believe they might be and what it costs to believe they won't. Neither path is sanctified. Neither is condemned. The show simply refuses to lie about the danger of expecting the universe to justify your faith in it. Hope survives here, but only in fragments, moments, and acts that do not pretend to be more than they are. Anything larger is treated with suspicion, not because it is false, but because it asks for more than this universe has ever promised to give. The show's final stance on hope becomes clearest when contrasted with how it treats belief. Belief, in Rick and Morty, is not inherently hopeful. It is often mechanical, habitual, or inherited. Characters believe things because they were taught them, because they make life simpler, or because abandoning them would require too much reconstruction. Hope, by contrast, is active. It is chosen. And because it is chosen, it carries responsibility. The show treats that responsibility with caution. Belief can persist quietly, even passively. Hope demands engagement. It asks the believer to invest emotionally in a future state and to endure the present in service of that investment. Rick and Morty repeatedly questions whether that exchange is ethical in a universe that does not reciprocate. When the future fails to deliver, the cost is not just disappointment, but erosion of self-trust. You trusted something that did not answer. That breach is where the damage occurs. Rick's posture toward hope is therefore less about pessimism than consent. He does not consent to emotional contracts he cannot enforce. The universe does not sign agreements. It does not acknowledge effort or sincerity. Hope pretends otherwise. The show frames this pretense as dangerous not because it is foolish, but because it encourages people to overextend themselves emotionally without protection. This is why the show's most hopeful moments are deliberately small and unscalable. A decision to stay for a moment, a choice to help without expectation, a refusal to abandon someone immediately. These moments do not gesture toward a better future. They exist entirely in the present. They do not require the universe to remember them. Their value is exhausted the moment they occur. That exhaustion is what makes them safe. Large hope, in contrast, tries to persist. It wants to accumulate. It wants continuity, recognition, and payoff. Rick and Morty treats that desire as incompatible with the conditions it depicts. The universe does not preserve meaning over time. It allows meaning to flicker, then move on. Hoping that flicker will stabilize is what the show treats as hazardous. This perspective also explains why the show is so resistant to inspirational closure. Inspiration implies that an experience can be generalized, that one moment of hope can justify future endurance. Rick and Morty denies that generalization. What worked once may not work again. What felt meaningful once may not repeat. The show refuses to let hope become a template. The audience, then, is placed in a difficult position. You are not encouraged to despair, but you are not allowed to rely on hope as a moral anchor. The show removes the guarantee that usually cushions engagement with difficult themes. You must decide how much emotional risk you are willing to take without narrative insurance. This is where Rick's worldview becomes both understandable and incomplete. His rejection of hope protects him from the sharpest disappointments, but it also narrows his life. The show does not resolve this tension. It does not reveal hope as secretly safe or despair as secretly noble. It leaves both exposed, incomplete, and costly. By the end, Rick and Morty treats hope the way it treats everything else that claims moral authority, with suspicion. Not because hope is evil, but because it is powerful. Power, in this universe, always extracts a price. Hope is no exception. The show's honesty lies in refusing to pretend that hope is free. It shows you what happens when people hope, what happens when they don't, and what it costs either way. It does not tell you which choice to make. It only insists that you understand the risk. Hope, here, is not a virtue to be praised or condemned. It is a decision made under uncertainty. Rick and Morty treats it as such. Dangerous, human, sometimes necessary, and never guaranteed. And that refusal to sanctify hope may be the most hopeful thing the show does. At its core, the show's treatment of hope is not an argument against emotional investment, but an argument against false insulation. Hope is risky because it tempts people to believe that emotional openness will be protected by structure, by narrative, by fairness, by progress, or by time itself. Rick and Morty removes that protection deliberately. It insists that emotional openness happens in the open, without guarantees, and that pretending otherwise is where harm begins. This is why the show never allows hope to become institutionalized. Institutions promise continuity. They suggest that hope can be stored, transferred, or safeguarded. Rick and Morty dismantles institutions relentlessly, not because they are always corrupt, but because they encourage people to outsource risk. When hope is institutionalized, individuals assume that someone else will absorb the cost if it fails. The show refuses that premise. The cost always returns to the individual. Rick understands this instinctively, even if his response is extreme. He refuses to outsource meaning, expectation, or validation. Everything he carries alone. This makes him durable, but brittle. He survives shocks that would devastate others, but he cannot bend. Hope requires bending. It requires trusting that fracture will not be final. Rick refuses that trust. The show never frames this refusal as wisdom. It frames it as adaptation under specific conditions. Rick adapted to a universe that punished expectation, and his solution was to eliminate expectation entirely. That solution works in the narrow sense that it reduces surprise. It fails in every other sense. It strips life of dimension. The show lets that failure accumulate quietly, rather than declaring it. Hope then becomes risky, not because it is naive, but because it insists on dimension. It insists that the future matters, that effort might echo, that care might extend beyond the moment. In a universe that does not preserve echoes, hope exposes the person carrying it to loss that cannot be explained away. The show refuses to anesthetize that loss with lessons or arcs. This refusal is what gives Rick and Morty its unsettling honesty. It does not say that hope is wrong, it says that hope is unprotected. If you choose it, you choose exposure. If you reject it, you choose containment. Neither choice is morally elevated. Both are survivable. Both are costly. The audience is left without a prescribed posture, and that absence is intentional. The show does not want agreement. It wants awareness. It wants viewers to recognize how often hope is treated as virtue without acknowledging its risk, and how often despair is treated as failure without acknowledging its function. By treating hope as a risk rather than a virtue, Rick and Morty strips it of moral glamour and returns it to its real status, a wager made in uncertainty. Sometimes the wager pays off locally and briefly. Often it does not. The show refuses to lie about those odds. What remains is not hopelessness, but clarity. You can care without projection. You can act without promise. You can stay without believing it will matter later. These modes are quieter, less cinematic, and harder to celebrate, but they do not require the universe to cooperate. Rick and Morty does not destroy hope. It disarms it. It removes the assumption that hope will be rewarded and leaves only the choice itself. In doing so, it forces both its characters and its audience to confront a difficult truth. Meaning is not secured by believing in the future. It is created moment by moment without insurance. Hope is risky because it asks you to believe before the evidence arrives. The show does not forbid that belief. It simply refuses to pretend the risk is obol, fair, or safe. And in a universe defined by indifference, that refusal may be the most honest position of all. Seen this way, the show's refusal to sanctify hope is also a refusal to exploit the audience emotionally. Many narratives rely on hope as a contract with the viewer. Endure discomfort now, and you will be rewarded later. Rick and Morty breaks that contract. It does not promise that suffering will be redeemed, clarified, or balanced. By doing so, it removes one of the most common manipulative tools in storytelling. The discomfort is not a means to an end. It is part of the condition being depicted. This is why the show often feels emotionally unresolved rather than bleak. Bleakness still points somewhere. It implies an endpoint of despair. Rick and Morty avoids even that. It leaves emotions suspended, unfinished, and sometimes unacknowledged. Hope would try to resolve that suspension by projecting forward. The show insists on staying inside it. That insistence reframes emotional maturity. Maturity is not presented as optimism, nor as resignation. It is presented as tolerance for ambiguity without demanding resolution. Hope in excess is a demand. It asks the universe to justify patience. Rick and Morty refuses to make that demand on the viewer's behalf. The show also subtly critiques how hope can become a form of coercion. When hope is framed as virtue, refusing it becomes moral failure. People are pressured to remain optimistic even when optimism no longer aligns with their experience. Rick and Morty rejects this coercion. It allows exhaustion, withdrawal, and detachment to exist without condemning them as weakness. Hope is not mandatory here. That freedom is unsettling, but it is deliberate. This does not mean the show endorses despair as clarity. Despair, like hope, is treated as a strategy with limits. It reduces exposure, but also reduces range. Rick's life demonstrates the long-term cost of treating despair as armor. He survives, but he does not expand. The show lets that stagnation speak for itself without declaring it a moral lesson. By refusing to elevate either posture, the show keeps the audience in a state of ethical discomfort. You are not told what to choose. You are shown what each choice costs. Hope costs vulnerability without protection. Despair costs possibility without closure. The show does not resolve that trade-off because resolution would be dishonest. What emerges instead is a narrow space between belief and resignation, a space where action is possible without promise, where care exists without projection, where meaning is not stored in the future, but exercised briefly in the present. This space is fragile and exhausting, but it is real. Rick and Morty returns to it again and again without naming it, because naming it would turn it into a doctrine. The final implication is not that hope should be abandoned, but that it should be demystified. Hope is not sacred. It is not owed protection. It is a choice made under uncertainty, and like all such choices, it deserves to be examined honestly rather than praised reflexively. By treating hope as a risk, the show restores agency to the individual. You are no longer morally obligated to believe in improvement. You are free to decide when belief is worth the cost. That freedom is heavier than optimism, but it is also more precise. Rick and Morty does not tell you to stop hoping. It asks you to stop assuming hope is safe. It strips away the fantasy that belief alone can shield you from indifference. What remains is not comfort, but consent. And in a universe that offers no guarantees, consent may be the only honest foundation hope can stand on. At the deepest level, the show's treatment of hope is about consent to reality rather than rebellion against it. Rick and Morty does not demand that its characters accept indifference cheerfully, nor does it glorify those who reject it entirely. Instead, it insists that reality must be met without false promises. Hope becomes risky the moment it is used to soften truth rather than face it. The show strips hope of its anesthetic function and leaves it exposed as a decision that carries consequences. This is why the series never allows hope to function as a moral shortcut. It does not let characters bypass grief, responsibility, or uncertainty by believing hard enough. Belief does not bend the universe here. Effort does not summon fairness. The refusal to grant hope special status is not cruelty, it is consistency. The universe depicted does not privilege optimism, so the story refuses to either. Rick's position, extreme as it is, exists on one end of this spectrum. He rejects hope entirely to avoid consent to loss. Others take the opposite risk, choosing hope despite repeated disappointment. The show does not rank these responses. It observes them. Each response is shown to be survivable in the short term and corrosive in its own way over time. The absence of judgment is the point. By the end, Rick and Morty treats hope the same way it treats love, meaning, intelligence, and power, as something that can exist, but only without guarantees. The moment hope demands protection, it becomes dangerous. The moment it asks to be rewarded, it becomes dishonest. The show will allow hope to flicker, but it will not allow it to rule. This is why the series resonates so strongly with audiences who feel exhausted by traditional optimism. It does not tell them to believe harder. It tells them they are not weak for questioning belief. It acknowledges that hope, when unexamined, can become another burden, another expectation to manage in an already indifferent world. In refusing to treat hope as a virtue, Rick and Morty does something rare. It trusts the audience to sit with uncertainty without being rescued. It refuses to weaponize hope as motivation or absolution. It allows meaning to exist without promising continuity. and care to exist without promising reward. Hope is risky here because it is honest about what it asks for: emotional investment without insurance. The show neither condemns nor celebrates that risk. It simply makes it visible. And in doing so, Rick and Morty does not eliminate hope. It returns it to its most human form, fragile, optional, and chosen with eyes open, knowing that the universe may never notice it at all. At this point, the picture is complete. Rick and Morty does not remove hope from its universe. It removes the illusion that hope is protected by anything other than the person who chooses it. That distinction is the foundation of the show's philosophy. Hope is not treated as a moral good because morality itself is not enforced by the universe. There is no external system guaranteeing that belief, effort, or sincerity will be met with care. Anything that pretends otherwise is exposed as a story people tell themselves to survive. The show's honesty lies in refusing to make that story easier to tell. What replaces virtuous hope is not despair, but awareness. Awareness that caring is a choice rather than a mandate. Awareness that effort may matter only locally and briefly. Awareness that meaning does not compound automatically over time. This awareness is heavier than optimism, but it is also more precise. It does not ask the universe to justify you. It asks you to decide what you are willing to risk without justification. Rick's tragedy is that he answers that question by risking almost nothing emotionally. He survives by narrowing his exposure until disappointment can no longer surprise him. That survival strategy works, but it empties the future of possibility before it arrives. Others choose differently. They hope knowing it may hurt. They care knowing it may not last. The show does not frame them as wiser. It frames them as exposed. That exposure is the cost of hope. Not failure, not foolishness, but vulnerability without insurance. Rick and Morty insists that this cost be acknowledged rather than romanticized. Hope is not condemned, but it is never sanctified. It is shown in its raw form. A wager placed in a universe that does not recognize wagers. Sometimes that wager produces a moment worth having. Sometimes it produces pain that lingers. The universe does not keep score. By treating hope as a risk instead of a virtue, the show refuses to lie about that imbalance. It does not tell you that believing will save you. It does not tell you that giving up will free you. It only shows you the consequences of each choice and refuses to smooth them into a lesson. That refusal is what makes the show unsettling and, paradoxically, humane. It trusts the audience to live without narrative guarantees. It trusts them to choose when hope is worth the cost and when it is not. It does not demand optimism. It does not glorify despair. It leaves space for something quieter and harder, deliberate care in the absence of promises. Hope survives in this world, but only when it is chosen without illusions. Only when it is small enough to carry and honest enough to admit it may not be rewarded. Anything larger, anything safer, is treated as fantasy. And in a universe defined by indifference, that kind of hope, fragile, optional, and unprotected, is the only kind the show is willing to tell the truth about.